unless they're actually trying to set off a war.
Beijing has slammed Washington for its latest comments on China's territorial brawl with Japan in the South China Sea, saying the U.S. should be more careful with its words and stay away from the region's matters. It is a reaction to statements made by U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who reassured Tokyo of American support and warned China against any unilateral action in the dispute. Beijing and Tokyo both lay claims to a string of uninhabited islands that are said to be rich in natural resources. For more on this, we're joined now by George Koo. He is the founder and former managing director of International Strategic Alliances. Mr. Koo, thank you very much for being with us.
Morning.
On its very basic level, Hillary Clinton was simply supporting an ally. Why are they making such a big deal out of this?
Well, historically, there's no tenuous basis for Japan to lay claim to the ownership of these islands. And the U.S. played a huge complicit part in creating this debacle to begin with. After the World War II, the terms of unconditional surrender specifically excluded any of the offshore islands as being part of Japan, but somehow the terms of surrender were changed during the peace treaty written by in San Francisco. The Chinese had no part in the forming of that treaty, and then for whatever reason in the 71, 72 timeframe, the U.S. turn over, quote unquote, administrative control of the islands to Japan. And that was without any consent from China or Taiwan or the other parties concerned. So the U.S. created this mess, and I think the U.S. is continuing to prolong the problem between Japan and China.
Now, does the U.S. even have a right to say anything? I mean, this is surely a regional matter. Now, to what extent can the U.S. try to pressure Beijing, and what kind of a reaction do they want?
Well, I think U.S. is, again, playing the strategic ambiguity game by, on the one hand, saying we're neutral about this and we're not taking sides between China and Japan. But on the other hand, they're saying, but we recognize that Japan has administrative control, and therefore we would be opposed to any unilateral action. But how did Japan get the administrative control? The U.S. turned it over to them. How did U.S. Originally get administrative control? It was because after World War II, U.S. had taken control of Okinawa, as well as the chain of islands, and including the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. So from the beginning to the end, the U.S. was really responsible for this particular mess.
Now, the U.S., you say, is responsible, and President Obama has made it a clear objective to boost America's influence in the Asia-Pacific region, which is right on China's doorstep. Now, does he have the resources to compete with China and even India, for that matter?
Yeah. Well, I think the U.S. has this role of being the policeman around the world and spreading the military forces all around the world. Now, can they afford it? Well, that's a different question, because it seems like in order to meet their military budget, which is ever increasing, they're probably going to have to borrow the money, and most likely they'll be borrowing the money from the Chinese.
Now, Washington is already deeply involved in several conflicts abroad. You just mentioned this. But here they're squaring up against a nuclear power. Could this get really nasty, even possibly another Cold War?
Well, that's not I don't believe that's China's intention. I think China has been asking Japan to recognize and negotiate rather than ratcheting up the tension. Of course, Japan electing Abe is not going to help, because Abe is very well-known hawk in this particular situation. I think that the saddest part is that the Japanese people, most of the Japanese people, truly do not understand that they were the perpetrators of all the atrocious acts of World War II, and these are the residual. Instead, the Japanese government has been very successful in portraying Japan as the victim of World War II rather than the perpetrator of the aggressor, being the aggressor. And the U.S., for its own strategic reason, viewed Japan as the preferred ally, and that's what's continuing to create this friction. But I'm not sure they're gonna. I think cooler heads will come and not go to war over these little specks of island. Certainly, China has never been the aggressor in terms.
Alexander Varansa from the Institute of Oriental Studies believes China and U.S. prospective involvements with North and South Korea could lead to a global conflict.
It will be a nightmare for many countries, and first of all for the 6 countries who met in six-party talks. We have the common border with Korean Peninsula, and China also. And of course China can be involved because they have the treaty, the alliance treaty with North Korea first, and they demonstrated recently their readiness to prevent collapse of North Korea. And it will be 2 superpowers involved, United States and China. It's possible that the Third World War can start in Korean Peninsula, unfortunately.
That goes off in full in the first shot. Now you have in the submarines, you have the warheads you have not yet discharged. Those go along the way as a second wave. After that, you're pretty much out of weapons. After which, most everybody is dead. Most logistical systems are dead, non-functional. You have a situation where the effect of this kind of firing creates a continuing effect which may go for several years. Now, instead of having one bomb, which is really it's a nuclear super bomb with thermonuclear implications. Now, imagine you have the same kind of thing or less, and you have not one big bomb. You have a whole barrage of such things. The exchange involves Russia, it involves China, which has a very significant thermonuclear arsenal. It implicitly involves India. It involves the United States. It involves the extermination virtually of Western Europe. And this is what Obama represents. It's what he's intended. This is the end of civilization.
And, you know, is the price worth it? I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
Let's take a look at the events of the past decade and see if you see a pattern. In Libya, Gaddafi was in the process of organizing a bloc of African countries to create a gold-based currency called the dinar, which they intended to use to replace the dollar in that region. U.S. and NATO forces helped destabilize and topple the Libyan government in 2011, and after taking control of the region, U.S. armed rebels executed Gaddafi in cold blood and immediately set up the Libyan central bank. Iran has been actively campaigning to pull oil sales off of the dollar for some time now, and it has recently secured agreements to begin trading its oil in exchange for gold. In response, the U.S. government, with mainstream media assistance, has been attempting to build international support for military strikes on the pretext of preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon. In the meantime, they established sanctions which U.S. officials openly admit are aimed at causing a collapse of the Iranian economy. Syria is Iran's closest ally, and they are bound by mutual defense agreements. The country is currently in the process of being destabilized with covert assistance from NATO, and though Russia and China have warned the United States not to get involved, the White House has made statements within the past month indicating that they are considering military intervention. It should be clear that military intervention in Syria and Iran isn't being considered. It's a foregone conclusion, just as it was in Iraq and Libya. The U.S. is actively working to create the context which gives them the diplomatic cover to do what they already have planned. The motive for these invasions and covert actions becomes clear when we look at them in their full context and connect the dots. Those who control the United States understand that even if a few countries begin to sell their oil in another currency, it will set off a chain reaction and the dollar will collapse. They understand that there is absolutely nothing else holding up the value of the dollar at this point, and so does the rest of the world. But rather than accepting the fact that the dollar is nearing the end of its lifespan, the powers that be have made a calculated gambit. They have decided to use the brute force of the U.S. military to crush each and every resistant state in the Middle East and Africa. That in itself would be bad enough, but what you need to understand is that this is not going to end with Iran. China and Russia have stated publicly and on no uncertain terms that they will not tolerate an attack on Iran or Syria. Iran is one of their key allies, one of the last independent oil producers in the region, and they understand that if Iran falls, then they will have no way to escape the dollar without going to war. And yet the United States is pushing forward in spite of the warnings. What we are witnessing here is a trajectory that leads straight to the unthinkable. It's a trajectory that was mapped out years ago in full awareness of the human consequences. But who was it that put us on this course? What kind of psychopath is willing to intentionally set off a global conflict that will lead to millions of deaths just to protect the value of a paper currency? It obviously isn't the president. The decision to invade Libya, Syria, and Iran was made long before Obama had risen to the national spotlight. And yet, he's carrying out his duty just like the puppets that preceded him. So who is it that pulls the strings? Often the best answer to questions like this are found by asking another question. Qui bono? Who benefits? Obviously, those who have the power to print the dollar out of thin air have the most to lose if the dollar were to fall. And since 1913, that power has been held by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a private entity owned by a conglomerate of the most powerful banks in the world. And the men who control those banks are the ones who pull the strings. To them, this is just a game. Your life and the lives of those you love are just pawns on their chessboard. And like a spoiled 4-year-old who tips the board onto the floor when they start to lose, the powers that be are willing to start World War III to keep control of the global financial system. Remember that when these wars extend and accelerate. Remember that when your son or your neighbor's son comes back home in a flag-draped coffin. Remember that when they point the finger at the new boogeyman, because the madmen who are running this show will take this as far as you allow them to. So how much time do we have left? It's a question I hear constantly, but it's the wrong question. Asking how much time we have left is a passive posture. It's the attitude of a prisoner who's waiting to be taken out to a ditch and shot in the back of the head. What are our chances? Can we change course? Also the wrong question. The odds don't matter anymore. If you understand what we're facing, then you have a moral responsibility to do everything in your power to alter the course that we're on, regardless of the odds. It's only when you stop basing your involvement on the chances of success that success actually becomes possible. To strip the ill-begotten power from the financial elites and to bring these criminal cartels to justice will require nothing less than a revolution. The government is not going to save us.